nerds, and welcome. We are Crossing the Nerdverse, bringing you yet another episode. My name is Travis. I'm joined, as always, by my fantastic co-hosts, Eric and Ryan. This week, we're going to be touching on a slightly sensitive subject, and that's going to be substance abuse. So if it's one of those things that you struggle with or are affected by, this is your warning, because it's
We're going to be
the topic from here on out.
Going to be treading on some treacherous ground today.
But it's a good topic.
It is, and somebody actually really needs to talk about it. It's one of those things that awareness is a primary tool, right? So
yeah, and it's just a huge problem. Well, I guess it's not as bad as it used to be. Since we're jumping straight into it, it has gotten considerably better. The 80s were probably the peak, which is most people remember like wild promos from like Ric Flair and Macho Man Randy Savage and anything Hulk Hogan said.
The poster boy though was definitely the Ultimate Warrior.
Yeah, that dude, like that. Yeah, that was a heavy substance. Honestly, since we're jumping straight into it, we have to bring up Razor Ramon, or Scott Hall, as you want to call him. Definitely battled addiction and managed to conquer it. One of the few that got the better of it, especially from that era. I will say we're probably going to skip over the Von Erichs in case any of you were wanting to tune in for that particular deal. That has been, I didn't want to say beat to death, but that topic really has been covered.
It's been well covered.
Just so extensively. So we're going to skip over the Von Erichs. Obviously had problems with substance abuse, but if you feel the need to hear about the Von Erichs, I highly recommend I think it's Iron Eagle? No.
Yeah, Zac Efron.
Yeah. Is it Iron? No, it's Iron Claw.
Yeah, Iron Claw.
So.
I just know Zac Efron, bit of a fan. I'm a fanboy.
Looks like we got Wolf Gamer in chat on YouTube. What's up, Wolf Gamer? Way to be the first one in. Nicely done.
He won the race.
But no, yeah, of course, guys, it's April, and so April is wrestling month. We've all been pretty hype about it around here. LA Knight. I actually don't own any professional wrestling gear anymore. Like I used to have a bunch when I was a kid. And so I was digging through it today.
Speaking of Jake the Snake, who was I was talking to you about when the podcast started mysteriously.
Yeah, Jake the Snake Roberts, he was my man.
Yeah, actually fired for a brief time from WWF due to substance abuse. Normally one of the guys, he did battle alcoholism. Normally one of the guys that remained pretty straight-laced as far as wild recreational drug use goes. If you want to hear him talk about it, I can't remember. I think it was on the Snake Pit podcast with Diamond Dallas Page.
I think that's accurate, yeah. Great podcast.
Yeah, dude, DDP does so much good stuff. For those of you who don't know DDP, it's Diamond Dallas Page. Big WCW guy. He actually runs a yoga and rehabilitation center, like physical rehab, and just got done doing a lot of work with Butterbean. So definitely check that out. That was a really inspirational story to watch on their podcast, his journey through health. But yeah.
So yeah, as far as it goes, we are going to be discussing it in regard to professional wrestling and the impact that it's had on it. Like Travis said at the beginning of the opening episode, at least for me and the way my homework went, I'm going to focus a lot on the culture that was professional wrestling in the 1980s and the very, very early 1990s. Because a lot of this recently came out. I'm going to say recently. It kind of had an expose on DDP's podcast. It's got picked up by several other kind of stances on it. And now there's whole sections on substance abuse and drug testing policies at WWE, which I have pulled up just in case we need to reference it. And I'm actually really glad that
wellness policies have actually gotten pretty extensive.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm glad you brought up Jake Snake Roberts' stuff he did on the Snake Pit, because that was a real eye-opener for me. I actually hadn't checked it out until I started doing my research for tonight's episode. And the stuff that was being kind of revealed during that podcast blew my mind. It probably shouldn't have, but it blew my mind, because you never really think about the fact that there could be performance enhancers or substance abuse in an environment like wrestling because it's a storytelling event, right? Like there's no performance as far as like a competitive edge. It
So the
turns out
drug
I was
abuse
wrong.
really, yeah. I mean, steroids has always been an issue, and that's really the thing that gets caught. Like most people get caught with now is performance-enhancing drugs like steroids, and that all came about uh, during the McMahon trials, the steroid abuse trials. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, 80s and 90s are a really sketchy time as far as the locker room goes for a lot of people. That culture did eventually start to shift and get much better. But it was to the point where doctors would just come into the locker room and would open up a suitcase, and performers could just go grab whatever pills they needed, steroids, like pain pills, anti-anxieties, caffeine pills,
Oh yeah, it was getting handed out
uppers,
like
downers,
candy.
whatever.
Whatever you needed.
Yeah. The big one that I think most of them were on was something called Halcyon, which is I think it's a muscle relaxer.
Yeah. Well, I know that there was a large section where Halcyon and Valium and similar stuff to that was a big one that Jake Roberts talked about because he was saying the way that they were doing their setups and how much they were performing, he was like, you get out of a match, your adrenaline high's going crazy, and you're expected to just walk across the street to the hotel and fall asleep, and nobody can pull that off. And so
Right.
things like Valium and Halcyon were just they were second nature, and you get into that cycle, right, where it's opiates to fall asleep and amphetamines to wake up, and it's all about keeping going, keeping churning, and it was crazy.
Yeah, and like Jake Roberts was never one of those guys that was big on like the steroids because he didn't have that body
Nah.
type. He was one of those guys that was just kind of naturally big.
Yeah, he
like
was-
those dudes that you just look at. It's like that's just a big guy.
Yeah, he was pure beef.
But
I
you
think
had
Ryan's having some
yeah,
difficulty.
Ryan having a couple of connection issues. But then you had guys like Ultimate Warrior, obviously steroids. Hulk Hogan came out and admitted steroid use.
Dude, his arms were so big, you knew it.
Yeah, Lex
Like,
Luger.
as a small child, I knew that was impossible.
Yeah. Well, no, you just ate your vitamins and said your prayers. You could get big like Hulk Hogan. He was an inspiration to the children's.
Yeah, broccoli, loads of it.
Yeah.
Loads of it.
All
Yeah.
Popeye style.
Oh, gosh.
Well,
yeah,
and
you
the
just finished.
Halcyons, that was a big one for me because it got to a point where they were so common and they were used so frequently that many of the performers knew exactly how to dose them and how to chop them up and how much to take because they would just be little bits and pieces every time they can. Okay, I don't have to perform for another 3 hours, so if I take half of one right now, I'll sleep
Yeah.
for 2.5, and then I'll just take an energy pill and get right into the ring. And because you have to fit that in with eating, and sometimes these guys never had an opportunity to eat a freaking burrito until it was 1 o'clock in the morning, 2
No.
o'clock in the morning.
Well, you could not eat you couldn't eat burritos backstage. That actually was one of the weird things Vince McMahon just like forbode.
Really, I did not know that.
He was a weird guy. You also couldn't sneeze backstage. If Vince McMahon could hear you, you literally get fired if you sneezed. Sneezing was a sign of weakness.
Naturally.
That makes sense.
And we have to include Vince in the talks as far as drug abuse goes. Obviously on steroids. No 50-year-old man gets that jacked that fast.
That was impressive though, dude. Like I was like, man. I
Oh,
was like,
he's-
you
and
must
he's-
really hate Stone Cold because like that's when he got big after he got like beat up
Yeah.
by Stone Cold a couple times.
Yeah.
That's when he got jacked, and I'm like, he did that, trying to be cool.
But yeah, so I mean, steroids always been a problem in pro wrestling, still is.
I mean, I think steroids is anything like a problem almost in anything that's sports related.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where
Um,
it's not, necessarily they don't have to throw a ball faster, lift more weights up off the ground. Steroids do aid in muscle recovery, and so when they go out and do those strenuous activities in the ring, taking the steroids, their muscles recover faster. They can then go work out, which helps maintain their physique. So they can work out more. They can still perform at the same level. Steroids are facilitating that. I think it's crescendo in WWF, which was making the transition to WWE. Because there was the steroid trials, there was investigations. People were getting like really long suspensions for performance enhancers. You had your
It's kind of-
protected stars that
Well,
obviously got to take some time off to recuperate from steroid use. One of them being Paul Levesque. You may know him as Triple H. As soon as this new steroid policies hit real hard, there was a time when his physique was not as well maintained as it was leading up to that, and it was obviously because he was coming down off of PEDs.
He was pretty jacked for a little while. I remember in the
Yeah.
beginning, Hunter Hearst Helmsley.
He's
he
always
had that like noble type thing to him.
That was such a terrible gimmick.
So boring.
Yeah.
But it did give
So
him
absolutely
it did give him
fucking
the name
boring.
for his finisher of the pedigree, though, which was iconic for him for.
I was gonna say I was
20
surprised
plus
he didn't
years.
switch the name when he changed.
Nah, but
everything
it's so
up.
good. That's such a good name for a finisher. That's not the topic at hand.
No, but like that was good.
Yeah. But we kind of jumped back and forth in time here, back to the 80s.
Yeah,
where
back
all
to
of
the
this
80s.
really started to go off the rails. This was back. I mean, I think it was just after they made the transition to the WWF from the WWF, because they were the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and then they shortened it to WWF. Obviously, after they lost the legal battle to the World Wildlife Foundation, they switched to WWE.
I didn't know there was 3 W's at one point.
When Vince McMahon Sr.,
just knew-
Vince's dad, was the promoter of the company, I should say.
Well, I
But
mean,
yeah.
and imagine what it was like for these guys in the 80s, especially like late 80s, right? The whole industry is dominated by these absolute titans, right? You're talking
Yeah.
about Jake Roberts, Hulk Hogan, 7 foot tall, 300-pound, just slabs of meat. And
yeah.
you had the whole Age of Giants thing was in full swing. And you're trying to get these guys into planes to do shows, traveling across the country, crazy schedules, late nights, early mornings. And
a lot of it wasn't even plane travel unless they had to go just an astronomical amount. Most of these dudes were actually carpooling in like vans.
just driving across country?
Yeah, you'd get done with the show, you'd pop across the street to a hotel, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, and then just drive the whole next day.
That's crazy. I know in the Snake Pit podcast, Jake Roberts did talk about, like, because he talked about both, right? Because he did actually, now that you bring that up, he talked about long distance driving, and he actually talked about how he preferred it because if you get some sleep in, you can get some time to eat, you can get some time to just sit down and you let your body relax. But it was so hard to get it going after that. It was almost like if you let yourself slow down, all of it caught up to you. Meanwhile, you get on the plane and the culture around the drug abuse became so cavalier. He talked about it became almost a prank culture, right? Where you'd slip it into somebody's water, or you pop it into a beer some guy was drinking, and he discussed an instance where it became kind of a joke where they'd slip you some halcyons, and if they got it timed wrong, suddenly they're trying to wake you up, they can't wake you up, and nobody knows what's going on, nobody's copping to it. And next thing you know, you're on a gurney on your way to the hospital simply because you took a sleeping pill. And I actually like the fact that he covered that so thoroughly, because when you talk about substance abuse, everybody always thinks of the same things. The same red flags jump to the front of your mind, right? It's performance-enhancing drugs, and it's things that are uppers. Everybody always talks about the uppers. Get that extra energy, a little bit of a faster reflex, whatever the case may be, no matter what sport you're in. That's why so many of the major sports have these severe crackdowns on performance-enhancing drugs. Then when you get to the WWF, it was kind of the Wild West in the 80s, right? Nobody was really regulating this shit. Nobody was really governing this kind of thing.
No, and it was also like really at the height of a lot of opioid development as far as the medical industries goes, where they weren't so tightly controlled that people were getting their hands on them, illicitly. And these guys would just buy them in the locker room, if not just straight up being supplied with them. He made it, I want to say it was on the Stone Cold's podcast. They were talking about, one of those guys from way back was talking about, he's like, yeah, like it was like a grab bag. You just walk by, that guy'd have a suitcase out, and you just picked up a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and just went on your way, and nobody thought twice about it. He was just hanging out in the locker room.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you think about what downtime they did have, right? These guys lived like rock stars. Everybody knew who they were. It was major entertainment. Not that it's dropped off nowadays. It's still a huge entertainment industry nowadays, but back then it's all anybody talked about. You either watched sitcoms or you watched wrestling. And so these guys, every time they went out to a bar, It was like running into a famous musician, right? There was always free beers and people wanted to buy stuff and be around them. It was a rock star lifestyle. And it really, when you listen to the reports, like from the Snake Pit podcast, that's what their whole life was. It had to feel like living in a whirlwind because your pills to sleep, your pills to wake up, and any downtime you get, you want to blow off steam. So you end up at the bars, you end up, in these kind of hangout spots. And I bet you some of these guys couldn't even remember what hotel they stayed in.
Oh, yeah,
they were just on to the next city.
Yeah, like I said, it's just so wild how uncaring like that locker room atmosphere was when it came to drug abuse, because it was just whatever you wanted to do, it was fine. Alcoholism, another big one, and that was one that Jake Roberts really struggled with, was alcoholism. Because it was one of those things where it wasn't just pills. It was just like, well, like, you're tired, you're alone, you can't really maintain a relationship with anybody, you're constantly hurt. So I mean, it's just beer after beer, whiskey bottle after whiskey bottle.
Oh yeah, and that's actually the point I was going to make a minute ago when I was talking about the performance-enhancing drugs. You start getting into something like professional wrestling, nobody thinks about substance abuse when it comes to alcoholism, when it comes to downers and the opioids and that kind of stuff.
Oh, which, by the way, I'm drinking root beer, in case anyone's wondering. I just realized I had a brown bottle that I've been hitting hard. It's a root beer. It's not actual beer. I'm not that insensitive to talk about substance abuse while downing a brew.
But anyway, it's a good call out, actually. I didn't think about that, but you're right. Like, it's just for the record.
Just for the record.
But yeah, and that's really what caught me off guard, I think, when I started doing my research into this. Is I think it's the best way to put it. It's the cavalier nature of it. They weren't trying to hide it. Nothing was being hyper controlled. It was all out in the open, and it was crazy. It was absolutely insane, the lifestyle these guys were living.
I guess it's because I follow sports so heavily. I wasn't surprised by the way they were doing it or anything like that. Like, because baseball players and like hockey players and like everyone's got caught using it, and like they were just during games and everything else. So what surprised me the most when I did a lot of this stuff was the particular individuals that did it that you wouldn't have assumed, and how like they came out and like really talked about it in like books and biographies and stuff afterwards. Like, I didn't think Bret Hart ever, because if you watch his matches, you watch him, like I would never be able to tell if he even had like a beer prior to the match. Like, some people you could kind of tell they had matches where they were off and things like that. Like, people just had different things happen. Like, I also didn't know British Bulldog did crack. That was weird to find out.
Yep.
Like,
no, 100%
that was an interesting one.
I don't know how much I believe, but I mean, we have to bring up Bret Hart and his propensity to hold very deep-seated grudges for a very long time. I don't know how true the story is about how he carried British Bulldog through the entire match while he was high on crack, and Bret, I was stone sober. I was like, you got caught with pills more than once. He had his own battles with alcohol abuse.
He did coke.
No, yeah. Well, and see, I think I agree with Travis though, because the instance that he's talking about, it was this widely kind of distributed thing, whereas he was falling down, he couldn't think straight, and couldn't perform. And like you said, people just said that he carried it through. I haven't watched a lot of the footage from the matches, I should say, where they talked about doing that. I don't know that I believe that particular story either.
I mean, it's hard to know, like, even when you're looking at it like in hindsight, right? When you're not looking at it fresh eyes, it's like, well, maybe, but also like, British Bulldog was never going to be like the all-star spectacular performer, because he wasn't Bret Hart, right? Bret Hart was just a caliber above. Like, I mean, there was a reason why they called him the greatest in the world. It's because he was good. Yes. He was an excellent performer.
His whole family, though, like, he came from a family of it, so.
Yeah, the Hart Foundation. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, the age of these people also was really surprising to find out. Like, a lot of people that were like on the alcoholism. So like, Scott Hall. I know Kevin Nash was on performance enhancers at one point. He has got himself clean as well, and now he just smokes pot for pain relief. I think he has his own weed brand at this point. I'm fairly
Would
certain.
not surprise me.
Hey man, I'd buy weed from Kevin Nash. Also, would like not. You can't tell him no either if he's going to sell
Yeah.
it to you. The man's like 7 foot tall and 300 pounds and change. Like he may be old, but he could still snap somebody in half. Like that's a big guy.
Well, and that's actually when you said it surprised you about the age. That was one thing I was not fully aware of is the age range that got covered.
They're so much older than you think. When
Yeah,
they buy them.
they
I was like, I
really
didn't realize
are.
you're that old.
And you know, people talk about that all the time. And you know, when you're talking about any other professional sport, you start talking about, oh, so and so is 38 years old. He's the oldest in his team. It's 45. He's the oldest in the league, and even the fans call him ancient. They call him dinosaurs. And then you start looking at some of the pro wrestlers, especially through the 90s, and it's like, how did you do that? I'm not even 40 yet, and I have a hard time getting off the couch, my dude. Like,
Yeah, like a lot of these dudes, they hit their peak like mid to late 30s, and then into their early 40s, which they really carry out. But you did have dudes that like broke into the scene early that suffered a lot with drug abuse problems, and I mean several deaths. Lance Cade being one of them. I was a
Oh,
huge
yeah.
fan of him during his debut. Obviously had drug abuse problems, was fired from several promotions, and then eventually did die of a drug overdose, which was really sad to hear. You never want to hear that.
oh yeah,
And stuff like that was really like when it got brought to light. Because I mean, I think there was an investigation in Florida, like the Florida pharmacy investigation that was linked to pro wrestling, and I mean, they found some big, like they found big names on that client list.
Well, and with the quantities that they were going through, it actually blows my mind that we didn't uncover something a lot more insidious, right? Where they were bringing in just industrial quantities of material. Because, man, looking at it, admittedly, the WWF and that kind of stuff, it was a huge industry, but there weren't just epic amounts of performers, right? You didn't have thousands of performers.
Yeah, they talked about it on the Snake Bite podcast, like how he said it was a wonder they made it through the 80s into the 90s with as many people that were getting suspended or had to like go into rehab or just take time off because of it, or the people that got fired for it. Like,
well, and that's actually
him not being immune.
Yeah. That's actually why I brought it up, is because the part of the podcast that really stood out to me and part of the research that really grabbed my attention was when the industry started cracking down on substance abuse. Not necessarily like performance enhancers or anything, but they started cracking down on everything from alcohol to cocaine to a lot of these opiates and the pills and that kind of stuff. And because it was such a small environment for such a money-making industry, especially through the 80s, suddenly you saw a lot of the performers started weaponizing it. And so you'd be out at a bar with somebody, or you'd be out hanging out with somebody, and people were sabotaging one another, coercing others into, here, just have a little bit more cocaine or have a little bit of this, or spiking drinks and that kind of stuff in order to get them fired. And I thought that was insane.
Yeah, bonkers that wrestling's always been plagued with that backstage politicking, to include a lot of my favorites. Shawn Michaels being extremely notorious for backstage politicking. We all remember the Montreal Screwjob. Not going to go into that. That has been beaten to death. But yeah, I mean, he had his own issues with substance abuse, and I think the Florida, and then the early 90s, I think there was a couple of other instances where they really started to hammer home that substance abuse wasn't going to be allowed. Because, I mean, you got to talk about some of their big name stars. Kurt Angle was taking like 40 something pain pills a day just to get through. Like his addiction was so high. And like he was always portrayed as this like non-alcohol drinking, and he didn't drink alcohol. Man alive, was he on a lot of pills.
Yep.
To the point where even like today he admits, he was like, I have no idea how I didn't die. Like 40 pills a day is astronomical. He was like, he would set timers to know when it was okay to take another one.
It's the long-term effect that's gonna be what gets him eventually, because of what it does to you.
Oh, everybody talks about the effects of alcoholism on like your liver, right? Nobody really thinks about how much those kind of pills, especially in those kind of quantities, destroy your liver and
And
eat up your
kidneys.
insides. Yeah.
Yeah, it
And
ruins your kidneys.
I'm actually glad that so much of this is come to light because, again, everybody thinks about alcohol. Everybody thinks about
Mhm.
cocaine, right? A large section of the Snake Pit podcast talked about cocaine. But these
Yeah.
pills in the quantities that they're talking about, that's terrifying to me. That's absolutely frightening.
Yeah,
And
and we touched on a little bit. There's two things we do have to talk about with the drug abuse, and that's going to be the plane ride from hell.
yep,
And that, again, Scott Hall so drunk he had to be helped off the plane. Ric Flair getting high on cocaine and sexually assaulting a stewardess. Everybody on the plane just being wildly drunk. The people that weren't drunk were astronomically high. People just passed out all over in the aisleways. Beer being spilled and thrown everywhere. And then to top it off, Flair having these wild parties at his home to the point where the police caught, I want to say it was one of the Funks. I think it was Terry Funk running naked through the neighborhood, kitchen
think
knife
that's
in his
right.
mouth, chasing a dog.
Yeah. Well, and you got to think, look at the culture at large, right? You're talking about a effectively combat-driven culture. Now, yes, it's scripted and it's all about the performance, but you start getting on enough destabilizing agents in your brain, some of your character starts to overlay, right? Some of your character starts to bleed through, and that bulletproof nature of where you're at in the story right now starts to bleed through. And especially when you're trying to decompress, you're trying to blow off steam so that you can get your mind right. And your body has all this adrenaline and all this adrenal response that it's been trained to call on at a moment's notice, and it's got nothing to do with it. You mix enough chemicals in with that kind of stuff doesn't even surprise me. The plane ride from hell sounds like a plane ride from hell.
Yeah,
And
and the situations were just time bombs, and
oh yeah,
luckily that has gone down. Obviously, you still have some people struggling with substance abuse being on the road. One of the more recent, moving more towards the modern era, Matt Riddle, perfect example of a substance abuse problem. Jeff Hardy, currently clean as far as substance abuse goes, struggled with drug abuse, pills, alcohol.
He's a sad one, dude. He could have been. He had a couple really good matches.
He would have had a much more amazing run at the top of the card if he could have maintained. The problem was his style of wrestling was so much impact on his body. Like every single one of Jeff Hardy's moves hurts him, right? Because his moves aren't about his safety; it's about the other person's safety, and it's about how they look, right? The Swanton Bomb. There's nothing about that maneuver, his finishing move, that does anything besides hurt your back. Repeatedly, he's taking big bumps off the top of ladders. He's jumping off the top of the Jumbotron into essentially what is a pile of cardboard. He's getting thrown out of the ring on top of a ladder. And while, yes, those ladders are aluminum, they're made very flimsy intentionally because they just go down to the hardware store. Like everyone's like, oh, they're gimmick ladders. They're really not special ordered. They're just really cheap aluminum ladders.
Yeah. Well, and that's the story with a lot of these props that they're expected to use, right? There's nothing really fake about a lot of the props these guys use. It's how they use it that lets them perform the way they do.
Right.
And it's wild when you really think about it, because a lot of this, like you said, they went down to Home Depot. They got a ladder.
They got the cheapest, flimsiest aluminum ladder that they could find at whatever hardware store.
Yeah.
Some of the tables were gimmicked to break easier or break in specific positions, right? But at the end of the day, that's still just a wooden table. Like it's that particle board table. Somebody got underneath it and cut like a line at the bottom. If you're sharp-eyed, you can kind of see sometimes if they don't do a good job covering it up. They do a lot better job now with like brown tape on the bottom, so you can't see where the cuts were.
When the performer hits just a little to the left where they were supposed to.
Yeah, and like it just like one of my favorites, I think the Dudley Boys were setting up somebody to go through a table, and they propped him up on the table while it collapsed at the cut. And I mean, it was a perfect cut. There was no like break or fragmenting or anything, so they had to go get another one.
I still like the one where I forget what fight it was. This was years ago. And effectively, they hit the table at the wrong angle, right? So instead of hitting it long ways, they hit it sideways, and it still broke on the cut, but it broke along the length of it, so it like hot dogged.
Yeah.
It cracked me up.
But so Matt Riddle, Jeff Hardy, I think one of the big ones that caught a lot of people off guard was Test. He was a big star in WWE. He got backstage politics. His was an intentional drug overdose, but again, it was one of those things. It was so easy for them to get their hands on it.
His, though, they said, because I was actually reading that one, they ended up saying that like it wasn't a suicide or something; it was something else. But no, I know what you're saying. But
yeah, I don't know.
I was reading because I went through the article. His was one of the ones that was like the 15 something that happened, like the Dynamite Kid, China,
Crash Holly,
stuff like that. And like there was a bunch of names, and his was on there, Brian Pillman. But yeah, on Test at the end of it, they didn't rule his. It said they didn't rule his a suicide. It was ruled.
I think they called it an unintentional,
accidental overdose or something like that.
I don't know how accidental it was. If I'm being perfectly honest on that one, he was going through a rough time, obviously, with as many drugs as he was on. Even if it was accidental, I mean, it was a matter of time.
What I found it kind of weird. A lot of them mixed everything together. Usually, whenever I read about ODs, it's like one particular, like a large quantity of one thing.
Yeah.
Not like a cocktail.
See, I have to admit that
totally
surprises me as well
things.
because
that was weird.
A lot of these overdoses and stuff, you find that what they're trying to capture, that feeling that they're trying to capture from the substance abuse, gets harder and harder to get the more you use, right? And so you end up overdosing because you're trying to capture that major high that your brain knows is available. And you need more and more of it to do it with most of these substances. And some of them are so dangerous that even a small amount is just devastating. We're talking about specific instances, and I'm going to tie back.
I have to make a quick correction. Brian Pillman died of heart disease, not an OD. I'm not saying he wasn't on drugs.
He died of heart disease?
He's the right era for it. Yeah, he died of like arteriosclerosis.
Oh, I could have swore he was an OD. Man, I stand corrected. I apologize.
He undiagnosed heart condition.
Interesting.
You got to remember some of these people when you're using and stuff like that, the way it affects your body, like sometimes you might think they would have, but it's just like the after effect of like what it does to like your heart and things like that is what gets you. Because I'm pretty sure there was a few of them that it was their heart or something gave out instead of an actual like OD itself.
Oh yeah. Well,
it's a difficult, complicated, interesting topic.
Well, and I know we're kind of bouncing all over the place with it right now because we're trying to cover a lot of the like highlights, right?
Yeah.
But realistically, what all of us are trying to really convey is the culture around it, especially through the 80s and the early 90s. And again, a lot of my stuff, I'm going to keep going back to Jake Snake Roberts because he was my favorite when I was a kid. And listening to him tell some of these stories on the Snake Pit podcast really opened my eyes. So I'm going to...
Some of his stories are wild.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about
drug-related ones are wild.
Yeah.
That was a different human being.
But Chavo Guerrera Sr. I want to talk about Chavo Guerrera. You know, he told a story where him and Chavo were effectively it almost felt like bullied into or peer pressured into some cocaine use. And the interesting part to me was it's going to tie back into the weaponization of drugs in the culture once the Federation started kind of buckling down and the industry started buckling down on it, because a lot of these guys were using the new drug regulations to weed out the competition. They were getting people fired and getting people kicked off of contract so that they could take it. And it's nuts to me to look at how prolific the industry was with so few main performers. And you know, there was a whole story that Roberts told where he said it was absolutely intentional. They were trying to get your job, and they used cocaine more than anything else to try to do that. So you'd show up to hang out or to a bar or at a party or whatever. It could be a house party, right? And they're going to set it down in front of you because they know you've used it. And they know it's tempting for you, and they're going to egg you on. Like, yeah, don't worry. And the big thing to me was there was this whole thing that came out for years where everybody was saying, don't worry, I have a way to beat the tests. Don't worry, I have, you know, this thing you can take, or this you can take, or this treatment, or take an ice bath while drinking a gallon of lemon juice, you know, whatever. That it'll beat the test. Don't worry, it'll flush it right out of you. And both Roberts and Chavo Guerrero Sr., in the instance that he talked about, they both ended up losing jobs because of that, because they bounced a test. Whereas the guy that was pushing it on him skated free and took the job. Surprise,
Yeah,
surprise.
A lot of those things, there's so much politicking in it, especially when it comes to stuff like that. Because obviously, when you do it, you don't want to be a mid-carder. Nobody joins like those wrestling promotions to be the mid-carder. They want to be that main event guy. They want to be the one drawing the crowds. Well, if you've got, the crowd hyped and then the backstage support from like producers, you're going to get skyrocketed. Other people are going to have to struggle. They're really going to have to like claw and climb their way up. Again, that's one of those reasons why you very rarely see those stars that suddenly just catapult to the top at a young age, is because these older dudes have established it or have worked their way up. What's up, Eric?
I was gonna say a big thing to remember too in regards to like when we talk about the 80s and the 90s in wrestling and why people did these shady things, it's also because of the fact that there wasn't as much opportunity to display yourself back then. So like nowadays,
That's
a
a
big
fact.
reason people don't have to do as much in regards to getting ahead is because you have more avenues to get some fame now. So like back then, as far as I can remember, it was mostly live. It was the best way to see them, and then you had pay-per-view.
Yep,
I don't even
pay-per-views.
remember them having consistent programming until Raw. I know they
Yeah.
had some. I'm not saying they didn't, but like
Yeah.
I don't remember them having the consistency that they did like when they finally got Raw on USA. That's really when it blew up, and then once they started getting the other like ECW, WCW, you started getting all these other branch offs of it. People had other avenues instead of just snaking each other to kind of get some fame.
Well, yeah, and especially through the mid '80s, it was all about the live show. That was the bread and butter. You wanted to go to the stadium.
That's all
you
it
wanted,
was.
yeah.
Yeah, it was one. You got to think those, even like now, there's what's called house shows that don't make TV. They're not official like records. It doesn't get really displayed, and it's just a house show. They're traveling through the city, on like a Wednesday. They stop over, they do a house show, they leave. Usually attendance is mediocre. It's usually the best times to see wrestlers try like new and fun stuff. I remember going to a house show in New Mexico and seeing The Rock attempt a Hurricane Rana. Like, that's wild. That's not something that's in his moveset. Like, that is not something he does. Right?
That's a
But he did
big
it.
dude to be
It was a
trying
house
to pull
show.
that off.
Like, he did it. Was it the best Hurricane Rana I've ever seen? No. Was it a Hurricane Rana? Yes. Was it performed by The Rock? Yes.
You imagine do you remember who the opponent was?
I want to say it was Farouk, but I'm not 100% on that. No, it was Rosie from Rosie, the tag team Rosie and Jamal.
Okay, because you have to be a pretty big dude in order to post for a Hurricane Rana with freaking The Rock. Like,
yeah, it was just
you gotta be stout.
Well, you got to think John Cena pulled one off on CM Punk, and the size disparity between them is astronomical. CM Punk is not a very big guy; like he's well built and like pretty athletic. But John Cena is just a big bulking dude, and he pulled a Hurricane Rana off. I think in a title match against John Cena, which is bonkers. But
watching some of the tricks these guys can pull off blows my mind.
Yeah. Speaking of CM Punk, one of the few people that really has maintained that straight edge lifestyle. I put it in air quotes because it's like the theme he had for a while. But like,
I was about to say that's part of his whole like shtick.
Yeah, he's never really had a problem with drug abuse or like pain pills. He does get injured a lot, so his recovery times are usually pretty extensive. But like no alcohol, no drug abuse. I don't think they've ever even caught him out at like wild after parties and stuff like that. So good on him for being in an industry that really beats you up to not have those problems.
Well, especially when you compare it to the culture at large, right? Even the vibe of the culture at large, trying to be a straight edge in something like that, where there's famously copious amounts of alcohol being sold, famously involved with uppers and downers and that kind of stuff. There's even characters where being kind of a drunk hillbilly is their whole shtick. And so trying to pull off the straight edge, like I'm the healthy guy, kind of gym rat, that's that's a track. That's kind of cool.
And like I said, and maintained it is the one that's like really
Yeah.
shocking, because you have a lot of those guys that have came out like, oh, I don't do any of those things, and then like they end up like you see them on the news for like substance abuse.
Well, see, and I
So
do
yeah,
like the fact that as you went on, the storytelling kind of evolved with the way that they kind of crack down on this kind of thing, right? And so you start getting through the 90s and you watch the industry really start cracking down on substance abuse, both with things like alcohol and cocaine and with the pill use. Now,
Mhm.
this might have been for the public face. We have to admit that, right? Nobody really knows what's happening at the hotel, on the plane, that kind of stuff. But I think the storytelling really got a lot better as we move into the 2000s. And I don't know if those two things are connected, but I really feel like the characters got a lot cooler. The shows got a lot more athletic. I liked it.
The caliber of athletes has changed, and that's because they've gone away from these big hulking giants. They're still there. Like obviously, WWE is still the land of the giants. They have, on average, larger performers than any other wrestling brand. That's
They got
changing.
away.
But
They started getting away from it though, because the whole steroid thing. That's why you started seeing the smaller people and stuff like that, because they wanted to give the appearance of
Wanted to
not
get away from the
everybody's
image.
juicing type thing. So that's
Yeah.
why you started to see the smaller people have a lot more success, and become a lot more mainstream. So
I think that was also following the popularity trend. Is that people want to see them run back and forth. They want to see the jumps, the flips, the high dives. I mean, that's why you have people now. Kevin Owens, not a small man, does spectacularly athletic things. That guy does running cannonballs. He does standing like sentons. Like he does a swanton bomb. He does
and the
tope
kicker is-
suicidas. Like
Yeah.
the dude is not small, and he's doing all those crazy things.
Well, and he could do it for a long time, which I think is the kicker. Like
Yeah.
he can do whole performances, never looking winded, never looking tired.
Yeah, KO can go. He's had his problems in the past with substance abuse as well. When he was still working in the indie promotions, if I remember correctly, he had a brief battle with addiction. Like I said, the big one in the modern era is obviously Jeff Hardy has been the one that in and out of rehab considerably. Like I said, he's clean now, which I'm really thankful for. Just because he's one of my favorites of all time. I love Jeff Hardy. So the longer he can stay clean, obviously, the better. We don't want a repeat of the Sting match. For those of you that are big WCW fans, that was bad. The fact they let him go out to the ring at all is just kind of despicable, in my opinion.
So do you remember? I didn't know this at the time, but I found it while I was doing this, and I do remember this. Some of it, the Legion of Doom, the big fiasco that happened with them, where Hawk was having like legitimate like substance abuse, and they kind of like put it into the show.
No kidding. I didn't know any of this.
I kind of remember like when they were doing it, because they did bring the third member in.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much smaller guy. I guess they called him Puke. I'm reading. I couldn't remember the name because it was such a small time for like it didn't stick out to me, so I don't remember it as well. But yeah, they definitely did Hawk like
they did him dirty
by doing
that.
Yeah, like I guess they pushed him like something about off a jumbotron at one point.
Mm-hmm. They made him like act like he was drunk on top of a jumbotron or something like that, and then fell.
Yeah, and
like
fall like they did a lot of that whole storyline was nuts, and they caught some flack for it.
I mean, yeah, because he was really battling alcoholism, and you're trying to turn it into like putting it into the show in certain ways is fine. I know I keep bringing him up, but he's one of the most prolific guys. Jeff Hardy and his substance abuse issues. His feud with Samoa Joe. It got brought up. And it got brought up because Samoa Joe was being a dick. Like, you know, Jeff was talking about how he had recovered, how he was doing better, how he had conquered his addiction, and all of this other stuff. And Samoa Joe comes out and, like, I think one of the comments he made was like, pretend like this is AA and shut your mouth when I'm sharing, right? That's fine. Samoa Joe's supposed to be coming off like a dick. That's a dick move.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It tracks. And then you have something like Vince McMahon where the whole storyline is bent around the addiction. You know, like there was a gimmick. I think Jeff Hardy was having a feud with Sheamus, and this was toward the end of the McMahon era. This was really a low point for WWE. But they had like a barroom brawl, and the theme was that Sheamus was an Irishman and could drink a whole bunch, and was like tempting Jeff Hardy to drink, and like Jeff poured a jug of pee on him because he was supposed to be getting drug tested or something like that. And it was just very poorly done. by Vince.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, an insensitivity to the issue was a huge problem. You start looking at the culture that we had through the 80s and 90s, right? The
Yeah, I
industry
mean, it's
is
because it's Vince is a dick. Like, I think
Yeah,
that's
Vince
the
is a
culture of
dick.
WWE can really be summed up by Vince McMahon's kind of a sketchy dude.
yeah.
But even at the time, though, like in society, like it wasn't looked at it like it is
Oh, yeah.
today. Like
You have an industry that's
The-
very dominantly male, like almost exclusively.
well, it was
And-
dominantly,
Yeah, it was.
exclusively in the '80s and
Yeah.
like most of the '90s.
And then you're going to take these guys and you're going to frame them as these hyper warriors, right? These pillars of crazy masculinity and power, and they're gladiators. During that time, talking about
good
something
analogy.
talking about something like an addiction openly was not okay, especially for males.
Yeah,
it was seen as
it was seen as a
weakness. It was mocked, and you can see that in the gimmicks that you're talking about. And we are at a point, I think, where it's starting to get better, but it's definitely not gone. And so I imagine
No.
if you start looking at the modern performers, a lot of them are going to have the exact same stories to tell in 5 years, in 10 years, where they're like, yeah, I couldn't talk about it because if I didn't come off the way I wasn't going to get any more shows. I couldn't show that kind of vulnerability.
Yeah. Well, and we do have to bring. I mean, we've talked about Jake the Snake enough. I think we can bring it up. Probably one of the best catchphrases came about through Jake the Snake letting his real life be part of his character. Because it's always those things, those little sprinklings of truth. That's why I look at a lot of wrestlers and I'm like, I bet you are actually just kind of like this. You're pulling this off well enough where I'm like, I bet you're kind of like this in real life. Who knows?
yeah,
Maybe they're just
I know
really
what
good
you're
actors
saying.
on some of them, but
I mean, Mark
Yeah,
Calloway.
yeah, God, the guy maintained kayfabe for like 35 years. What a
Yeah.
stud. But yeah, he brought up his struggles with alcohol as part of a storyline. It was actually one of his comeback arcs where he had, cleaned himself up and found Jesus, and that led us to probably one of the greatest catchphrases of all time. And that's when Stone Cold won King of the Ring against Jake the Snake during his comeback tour, and he was like, "You're talking about John 3:16. Well, Austin 3:16 says I just whoop your ass." And so that led to, I mean, that was the launching point for Stone Cold.
Oh yeah,
that whole persona can be narrowed down to that one point. Like, that was the point
Absolutely.
that skyrocketed that man. And it came
His-
about where addiction and storytelling was done a little better than, like, let's pretend to have someone drunk on the Jumbotron. Like, let's pour something that looks like pee on another wrestler. I think those ones where the wrestlers get to handle it always do a little better than when Vince got to put his little fingers in the pie, because he's, like I said, he's just a bad person.
I constantly find myself surprised every time I think that Vince has hit a new low. I'll dig into some of his backstory and I'll learn some detail that I'm like, wow, I was so wrong. It can go so much further down.
He had to have been on he had to have been doing cocaine and shit when he wrote some of these scripts.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
Well, they said he was. Like, if you look, like, part of, like, the things I'd found, like, people had said that he wasn't. He supposedly, like, admitted to it himself, like, to other wrestlers and stuff like that. So I don't claim to know for sure any of this. I mean, but
yeah, I just not sure. Any terrible thing I hear about Vince McMahon at this point, I'm just not surprised anymore. Like,
I mean, you
is
gotta-
anybody
you gotta
really
think- Yeah.
surprised?
I don't get surprised by a lot of this kind of stuff anymore.
not to justify any of his actions, but like the way he skyrocketed and made WWE just explode. Because yes, it was the wrestlers too, but he did have a heavy hand in the starting point, like the lighting of the fireworks, if you will,
Well, and
that led to like it blowing up the way it is. And his business savvy, like, just was tremendous.
Well,
I'm
and see,
not
I
taking away
do-
his aggressive, like, business stance on WWE, because for
Yeah.
sure he made WWE into the wrestling juggernaut, right? He forced a whole bunch of other people out of competition. WCW, I don't know if as much a downfall is as much Vince's fault as everyone likes to
yeah, I'm
like
going to give
give
you that.
Vince credit for. I feel like WCW kind of shot
Did
themselves
themselves in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of the
Even
same
the
story with
wrestlers from
NWO.
WCW did.
Like, but with Vince, I'm going to give you that he is very business savvy, and he's business savvy in the way that he's extremely aggressive with his business tactics.
Oh yeah.
But I think that a lot of his success doesn't necessarily come down to his wiles or his cleverness, because I mean, the man was selling something that everybody wanted and had very little competition. And so, yeah, he's got it, obviously, but
it took a long time. Like, wrestling did not take off for a long time.
yeah,
Like, wrestling was not like something like you just got excited when it came to your hometown in like the 80s and the 90s because you got to see it. Like, wrestling didn't explode. Like, I truly don't think wrestling took off until Raw came out. That's when wrestling took off. I mean, did you name the shows prior to Raw? Like,
Sunday Night Heat, Saturday Night Main Event,
like I don't even remember
WrestleMania,
those. And I
SummerSlam,
watched
Bash at
them.
the Beach.
Well,
like,
see, those are pay-per-view though. But
that doesn't
you're
matter.
naming like pay-per-view.
It's
But
still a show.
yeah, but not everybody could watch that because you had to pay. When
So
they put Raw out, that's when wrestling just like.
Saturday Night Heat, Sunday Night Main Event were both TV shows on various programming, right? The first nationwide broadcast was TNT, and it was Raw is War, right? And that was 88? Ooh, when was the first Raw broadcast?
Well, you looked that up. I will say I'm going to give you credit on part of that, Eric, because when Raw came out, the entire scene not just exploded in popularity, but you got to see a lot of these like bizarre spin-off kind of things come out, right?
1993.
93, all right. But you had a lot of stuff because you start looking from, I'm going to say 95 to 2005, you had a 10-year span. And suddenly you starting to see things like the XFL came out, you know, in that whole goofy era. And, you know, all this kind of stuff that really were on the back or in the wake, I guess, of Raw's success. And so, you know, everybody knows about Monday Night Raw. But I would say that I agree with you, at least partially. Not 100%, because I think Travis has a point. I think that a lot of these programs were very, very popular, and they were doing very, very well earlier on. But with Raw, you started seeing big advertisement, and you started seeing a lot more merchandise and commercialization of the individual performers. You start talking about the Austin 316. That was his merchandise platform for years and years.
Yeah,
you know, everybody had a shirt. Like, yeah,
NWA had a syndicated television show. NWA Championship Wrestling was on TBS for about 12 years.
I watched wrestling like in the like 90s a lot, and I still don't remember most of, like, obviously I know the pay-per-view events because yes, I found a way to get my hands on them one way or another as a small child. But like I don't remember the other syndicated shows. Like I think I remember the NWA one on TBS.
Yeah, so I mean, you got to think, you know, WWF, again, the precursor to WWF, and then WWE. They started a syndicated TV show in 1972. So it was on TV. Was it nationally broadcast on a major network? No. I mean, a lot of these are, you know, TBS, syndicated TV.
And like, where did they rank in like rankings, like TV and stuff?
I mean, most of that stuff was pretty late night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
that's what I'm saying. Like, Raw is when it blew up because Raw came on at a prime time. It was like there was just so much. Like, if you could look at numbers and things like that, like if financial records and things, I'm telling you, like, but again, I would bet after the first year of Raw, like that company probably doubled in like
before Raw was value. Saturday Night Main Event, and it was on NBC and Fox. Like they had two separate TV deals, and that lasted from like the 1970s all the way into the early 90s when they started Raw.
Yeah.
And that had a pretty prime time slot too, because I mean that wasn't super late at night on a Saturday, and getting any TV time on a Saturday before midnight is great.
Yeah,
because you got to think most of your news is going to come on between 9 and 10, and then whatever programming comes after is garbage time. And I mean they were on at like 9 something.
Yeah.
So I mean it wasn't a nothing slot. Like obviously Raw took off it being Monday night and it being nationally broadcast and also live. That was the big seller was it was not pre-recorded.
Yeah, because you're
Yes.
talking Grand Ballroom, Manhattan Center, primetime television. Like,
Yeah, and it
I
being,
definitely don't want
like I
to
said, being
downplay
live.
what Raw pulled off, at all. But well, and you started seeing through the '90s is where we started seeing the first of the kind of breakaway from just the wrestling performance with some of these guys too, right? Because you look at Hulk Hogan in the '90s, he'd stepped kind of away from the scene. He wasn't doing as much, and he started appearing in like movies and doing like TV and movies and stuff. I remember when
Fantastic movies, just
Yeah.
some of the best cinema.
some of the best ever. One of my favorite movies when I was a kid, and me and my brothers used to watch it all the time. It was like the third or fourth Three Ninjas movie, and
Yeah.
Hulk Hogan was in there, and they had to like ninja their way through this amusement park and fight bad guys and stuff. And I don't even remember what the plot was, but I can remember Hulk Hogan's character all the way through that. Cracked me up. And so, don't get me wrong.
High Noon at Mega Mountain. That was the name
Yes.
of it. High Noon at Mega Mountain.
That's exactly right.
The best Hogan movie was always Mr. Nanny.
No,
Oh, yeah.
Suburban Commando.
Oh, I
that was-
forgot about Suburban Commando. I know
Do you
we've
wanna
gotten
know-
away from the substance abuse kind of stuff, but
No, I mean he was on cocaine.
you can
Yeah,
tell
well,
in
he did
those
it.
movies, man.
Yeah, it's not hard to depict that. Well, I mean, you got to think, Suburban Commando had probably the greatest villain ever, and that's Mark
Mr. T?
Calloway.
Oh.
No, Mark Calloway was the bad guy.
Yeah,
was
he
the
was
one
the bad
chasing
guy.
Hulk Hogan down.
Oh.
Yeah, got a fun little knowledge for you. I want to say a lot of these, substance abuse, obviously that led to death. I'm just looking at the list of these guys, and I'm wondering how many of these heart attacks are directly related. Because I mean, Bones brought it up with the amount of damage that drug abuse does to your internal
Yeah.
organs. How many of these heart attacks are directly related to
Steroids and everything else.
steroids and
Well, and it
ephedra
brings
and
up-
amphetamines and pills?
It brings up a real concern, right? Because he brought it up in chat on YouTube. You start combining a lot of these effects where you have consistent repetitive injury, consistent repetitive concussions, mind-altering substances, taxing chemicals on your heart, your kidneys, your liver, your intestines. And, the official ruling is going to be heart attack, heart disease, X, Y, Z. But all of these are such exacerbating factors that, I mean, I know officially it's this, but you look at some of these, because I brought up the list a minute ago, and you can tell, like, it had to be the pills. That's the one that really stuck to me. Like, yes, the alcohol and the cocaine were extremely prolific, but it was the 80s. You didn't have an industry in the 80s that didn't have some level of that.
Yeah, and it boils down to like the environment that they're in. Again, these people have
Mhm.
we make jokes about it, like when we create characters for D&D. Sometimes is nobody becomes an adventurer with a happy home life.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing with a lot of these pro wrestlers, man. Like that is not an easy life, and a lot of them come from a family that have done pro wrestling. Well, like obviously one parent is always going to be on the road. So have Brian Pillman Jr. following in his father's footsteps, hopefully without as many medical issues.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Again, Brian Pillman, his death, like his heart attack, may have been induced by the drug abuse, but it wasn't directly caused by it. He had a lot of I think he had an undiagnosed heart condition, if I remember correctly. But you have to, like Road Warrior Hawk. We talked about the Road Warriors and stuff. That heart attack had to have been directly related because I mean, you got to think he was in his mid 40s, I think, when he passed away.
Yeah, I think so.
And so, yeah, it's probably a combination of diet and then drug abuse and alcohol abuse and stuff like that. Definitely has to be a contributing factor. Eddie Guerrero, I'm still certain that his heart attack was caused directly by, I think ephedra was the big one at the time that they were giving to people coming off of steroids, as like something to wean them down. And for those of you that don't know, I think ephedra is a derivative of amphetamines of some kind, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I've taken chemistry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm no good with chemistry, so.
Well, and I think it's very telling. So I went ahead and I brought up the substance abuse and drug testing policy from WWE, right? It's a pretty extensive, piece of paperwork, but it's a pretty extensive policy. And the very first section, the very first part, is the non-medical use and associated abuse of prescription medications and performance-enhancing drugs, as well as the use, possession, and/or distribution of illegal drugs by WWE talent are unacceptable and prohibited by policy. Here's the kicker for me. As is the use of masking agents and diuretics taken to conceal or obscure the use of prohibited drugs. I think it's very telling that has to be your opening sentence in your policy, right? And I mean, as far as a mission statement goes, it's to the point, fantastic. But to have to bring up masking agents and diuretics in the first sentence of the policy shows the struggle that they've had to go through from where they were to where they are now. And I actually feel pretty confident when you look at modern wrestling, the stuff that's going on right now. I think it's gotten significantly better, not just in performance, even though that's true. Storytelling has gotten a lot better, but I also think a lot of the talent and a lot of the performers are performing a lot cleaner than we used to see.
Yeah, and like you said, you're still gonna have those guys that get caught.
Oh yeah, that's just humans, right? Like,
yeah, Bobby Roode got caught with some performance enhancers towards the end of his career. That was before he broke his neck. Obviously, he's backstage as a producer now and no longer a performer, which tier because I really liked Bobby Roode. His character work was much better than his in-ring work, but I digress. He got caught with performance enhancers. Braun Strowman was caught with performance enhancers. Brock Lesnar caught with performance enhancer. I know, that one's shocking, right? That mountain of a man.
Yeah, weird.
Whose delts touched the back of his cranium was
and
doing
he could still get up and
steroids.
move like a freaking dog chasing somebody. Like,
God, yeah,
Something
he was
though,
exceedingly fast.
One thing I do want to point, like, WWE, yes, the performance and stuff is better now. Part of it is, thankfully, that it's probably a much cleaner industry, you would hope. There's a lot more people now, so it'd be interesting to see who's still using. But it's also because they branched out, like, and they got different types of characters and stuff, which is also thankful. Which also is from, like, the fact that they were getting away from steroids and stuff like that. So you gave people chances that didn't normally get chances, which is why we have what we have today. Because I know I always try to look and find some bright, shiny spot and things. So the upside to the constant steroid use is they eventually had to get away from it. And we got shining stars of smaller people, like Shawn Michaels got really shined on it at a point when that was... Bret Hart had another run when they were trying to get rid of steroids and stuff. So, like,
yeah,
yes, horrible time and era, but there was a few good things that came out of it. We got more technical wrestlers and we got more mic work wrestlers. Like, I definitely think if it wouldn't have came to light and they kept the trajectory they were doing, wrestling would still be popular, but you'd have a lot less of the people that were really good mic and not ring people. Like, if you weren't huge, you were not going to make it. So a slightly bright spot.
Well, and when we're talking about ones that have pulled themselves out of the industry and started doing other things, obviously we're seeing a lot of wrestlers that are moving into making movies and becoming actors and that kind of stuff. But I want to talk about the 70s and 80s era where you had the WWF and that kind of stuff. And I'm going to bring up Jesse Ventura.
Jesse the Body Ventura.
The Body.
Also prolific steroid user.
Yeah, well, and he's talked about it, right? And he's talked about what the industry was like.
A lot of those dudes have like come clean and they're like, yeah, I was on the juice. Like,
I think everybody came clean after the 70s and 80s. So people understood. There was a few people that
held on for like a long time. Like, bless him, Randy Savage was like, I was never on steroids, like, up until...
Oh, really?
Yeah, like, I think the last few years before he died, he was one of those people who was like, I didn't do steroids. I'm like, yeah, you fucking did.
I'm not sure about that, buddy.
Yeah, your forehead doesn't get vascular from not taking steroids. Like, that's not how this works.
But yeah, there was a whole bunch of exposés that he had. And I mean, he was still an excellent governor and put a lot of it behind him and moved through and was well liked. I've never actually looked into a lot of his political campaign or career, I should say, so I'm not going to quote on that. but he seems to be well liked by a lot of the constituents. And that's a guy, there's not many of them that have stepped out of the life into something like that. And especially stepped out of the life during the 70s and 80s, where we've already extensively covered what it was like and the nature of the industry at that time. To go on into politics and into that kind of environment, I think Jesse Ventura is a really good example of the extremes that you reach, because you can tell just at the way his body changed after he got out of the industry and started moving into these other affairs. He starts trying to get clean, and it just degrades. It destroyed him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
I do. I think we've covered a lot of the male topic on it. I think we should, for the last couple of minutes, cover some of the more notable female performers that had substance abuse issues.
yeah.
Mostly being the two big ones. China obviously
Yep.
had a big substance abuse problem, both during and after her WWE career. During, obviously, took performance enhancers, as was, just the case with everybody really in WWE at the time. The early 90s were just rife with steroid use. You were getting away from more of the just rampant drug abuse and pain abuse, because obviously the wellness policy was still evolving at that time for pro wrestling. But yeah, Miss Elizabeth died of a drug overdose. A lot of people know her. She was the manager and then on again, off again wife and girlfriend of Randy Savage. And I want to say it was Lex Luger, I think was the other person she married.
Yeah, it was Lex. I think she was found with Lex at the end, at his apartment or their apartment together. They found all kinds of different pills and stuff there too.
Yeah, and
that's when he got clean and found God.
Yeah,
I'm not being cheesy, folks. I know I have a way to do that. I'm actually being serious.
Yeah,
he really did. Got clean after she passed, and at least from what the article said. I don't actually know. I don't know Lex. We don't have conversations and coffee and stuff together. But from what I've read, that the moment he got clean and kind of found God was after
that particular
sort of shock
that's
event.
that's a pretty awful thing to have happen, is to find your significant other dead from a drug overdose. Which they called it drug and alcohol toxicity. Basically she took a bunch of pain pills with her vodka and passed away. Ruled as an accident. Feels kind of intentional.
Well, it's hard to tell because especially around that time, everything was so under wraps, right? We had very little insight, and everything was very sensationalized around a lot of the media at that time, just kind of in general. And so it's hard to speculate on what was going on with that kind of thing. And I'm sure the stress that it put on the family and that kind of stuff was unimaginable. And so hearing that he got clean after that does not surprise me at all. And especially when you start looking in the industry in the late 90s and in the early 90s going into the late 90s, a lot of these performers were performing 300 days a year. And so you're talking just trying to recover from injuries and trying to recover from the stresses of that kind of job and still perform at that rate. It doesn't surprise me that we ended up with so many professional performers that were on this track and on this train, especially with pills.
Yeah, and again, talking about the ones that managed to get clean, I think a big nod has to go to Kurt Angle. Through numerous injuries throughout his career, wrestled in the Olympics, actual, not professional wrestling, but wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, I think was his category, with a broken neck and won a gold medal, right? You can't take that away from him. He was in extreme pain for years. And then just, pill, to the point where he was taking 40 a day.
Oh, yeah.
But to get back on the topic at hand before we go off the rails again, China was another big one. That just didn't manage to conquer addiction. Had such a prominent spot. I think she was the only female to hold the Intercontinental title in the WWE, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong at this point.
I know she was definitely the first.
Yeah, she's definitely the first woman to hold the Intercontinental title. I don't know if she's been the only one, which is a huge step in the right direction as far as equality goes, especially TV time. But just after her release, there was just career went downhill, kind of got buried by the company, which is a shame. That backstage politicking gets everybody at some point. But yeah, she eventually died
If
of an
you look,
OD.
there was a few ladies that were like, during that time, drug and alcohol things was kind of like, if you look, Sunny.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, she still has substance abuse problems, if I remember.
Yeah,
right. I think
like
she just got another DUI in the last couple of years.
China,
I think the only one that's clean was, or kind of clean now, is Sable from back then. I know.
Yeah,
I think
didn't she marry Brock Lesnar?
I know they were. Now, to say that they still are, I
Yeah,
have no
can't
clue.
They
face that.
still are.
But like, out of the old ones that I remember, though, like, I think she's come out is like the only one that's come like around. I don't know how to say it in a way that is appropriate because I don't have big words. I use fuck for a lot of things.
They're
so
still married.
That's good to know.
I'm not surprised. Like, they were always. But anyways, yeah, I think she's the only one though that's like come around, like, is productive members society and like doing good.
You have quite a few from like the 90s that managed to have careers outside of wrestling. I mean, you had Tori Wilson, Michelle McCool, married the Undertaker, so big step up for her. Obviously, Mark Calloway, handsome man. Just kidding. Michelle McCool, also very attractive for those of you that aren't uninitiated. She does like fitness stuff, I think, on like Instagram.
Yeah, I was actually about to bring
does
that
like
up.
fitness
I think she
videos.
does
I think
fitness.
she's a fitness coach. Yeah, she's still in like crazy good shape, which is wild. Mark Calloway is also still in fairly good shape. His arms have gotten much smaller since he's not on the road anymore, and I think a lot of people were shocked when they saw him. They're like, his arms look skinny, and I was like, well, yeah, he's not pumping iron 4 times a day.
He looked like he struggled a bit.
Fun. Like,
he looked like he struggled a little bit with that choke slam at WrestleMania.
Do you know
I'm not
how much
gonna
bigger
lie.
The Rock has gotten since his WWF?
Yeah,
like,
that's what I mean. Like,
much bigger man.
Well,
do you know that he keeps coming on all these different things? Like, people want to know if he's natty or not. Like, how they do all those like Instagram and different things.
Yeah.
All the different pages. Is he natty or not because of his age and how big he is? There was actually like, I'd like to find the source, but someone that was like an actual like participated in bodybuilding and stuff and like did it all the time. He came out and said there is a chance, like, he's not saying he is or isn't, but he like talked about like, because of his workout routine and because he's been doing it for so long, like it's not an impossible thing because of the routine and everything and his activity.
He's also not one of those guys that just like blew up overnight.
He was always kind of a big guy.
Well, he slowly, like, he got bigger.
Oh, absolutely.
As his career got on, he just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then he got out and started his acting career and just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was not one of those things where he was like, yeah, he was, The Rock. We all remember doing the first People's Elbow on Monday Night Raw, and then 6 months later is the hulking behemoth that we see today. It's been like a progressive thing. So there is a solid chance, because you look at Batista, who admitted to being on steroids, but he's managed to maintain that without it.
Yeah.
And he's, I believe, older than The Rock by a handful of years.
He's got a crazy diet and stuff. He does too. I was looking at.
Well, when you start looking into,
I watched a dude do a challenge where he's eat like The Rock for a week.
Yeah.
And the amount of calories that man had to go through, and he was just like, all right, so I get up at 4 a.m. I run 5 miles. I lift weights for an hour. I have breakfast 1.
breakfast
1. I do work. I work for 2 hours. I go to the gym again, have another hour-long workout where you do like press and cleans. I have a second breakfast, shower, do the normal work day. This is what I eat at lunch. After lunch, another workout. I mean, so you're talking about a guy that's doing 4 to 5 workouts a day, plus conducting business. I mean, that's a solid chance that he's gaining all that naturally. There's also like, no one's going to know unless they test him. So,
well, and he's
also not doing anything to be tested. So if he's on steroids, like, that's a personal choice at that point.
I think that's actually very indicative of what we wanted to talk about on the show tonight, right? Because it was so prolific that it became synonymous with being muscular and built and large. It's like, oh, dude's juicing on steroids. To the point where there are many people that to this day still think, oh, yeah, it's the magic muscle juice, right? I just take the shot and then I bulk out. Like, that's all it takes. Where that's simply not the case.
If you take steroids and don't work out, you're going to get super fat.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Like, that's what happens. You just balloon up.
But I think it really shows what we were trying to talk about, that now you can't be big or well maintained, and just because you have discipline without everybody going, I wonder if he's on steroids, because that's how prolific it was in the industry. And I think it affected society at large.
For sure. Well, and then like even you had like the world's strongest man competitions. Every single one of those dudes is juicing. Like, there's no way they're not. And a lot of them have come out and just be like, yeah, like everybody in the like powerlifting scene is juicing up until the point where competitions roll around, and then as soon as competitions roll around, everybody gets clean and then does the lifts.
Well, and so many people found interesting ways around it, right? When you start looking at other sports, what was it?
Blood doping.
Blood doping. That's exactly what I was going to bring up. Where it's like, technically, you're not putting anything else in there except for extra blood.
Yeah, a little extra red stuff.
Yep. And so, yeah, I think that's really the shame of it, is you can't have anybody that has that kind of build or performs at the level that these guys performed at without a lot of the fan base, the audience, us, right, doing this podcast, going, I don't think it's natural. I bet you they're juicing. I bet you they're on the stick. Like,
you know who was amazing and no one thought he was juicing? Just throwing it out there. Tom Brady. We knew he wasn't juicing. He was just that good.
Tom Brady is the anomaly of professional athletes. That dude had such an obscenely long career. Like, it's unfair for everyone's like, do you think they're going to catch up to Tom Brady? I was like, not unless he plays in the NFL for another 20 years. Like, we'll see.
Yeah.
Like, even if they don't win as many rings as Tom Brady, it's just to be like, are you going to have a career that was, 3 decades long?
Well, that's really the kicker, right? I mean, and that applies to professional wrestling, because you're talking about an industry where the injuries alone are astronomical.
Astronomical. Yes, so many. Oh, by the way, all the people. So Sheamus made his comeback. I almost shaved back to the Sheamus cut just to celebrate his return to the WWE. Everybody was like upset because they were like, Sheamus looks fat now. And I'm like, the man is 43 years old and just got done having major neck surgery. If he put on a little bit of softness around the midsection, that's fine. He's still 6'10". He can still crush you.
Still whoop you, yep.
Yeah, he picked up Ivar from the Viking Raiders, who's like a 300-pound man, on his back, and then leapt from the, like, lifted up, and then jumped out off of a turnbuckle with a 300-pound grown man on his back. I think he's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'll be all right.
Yeah, like.
Well, and you get that
just because he put on a little extra circumference, I don't think is an issue.
Yeah.
So.
All right, with that.
Yeah, with that.
Everybody, CrossingTheNervers.com. Go there, check it out.
That's everything you need.
Merch, YouTube, everything like that.
Links to find us on all our podcast platforms.
Yeah, we're everywhere.
We are
legitimately are. And then the subscribes. When you check it out, if you enjoyed it, if you didn't, whatever, maybe just hit the subscribe.
For sure.
Yeah, for real, guys.
Next week.
That's a big one. You can support the with helping us out with our merch and checking out that kind of stuff, but you don't have to give us our money to support your show. Really, what we need is for you to do all those fun algorithm things, like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends about us. I happen to think we're a pretty fun little group here that talks about all kinds of different stuff. So yeah, give us a like, tell us what you think.
Have a good time.
And more than anything, we're really appreciative of your comments. Your comments on these videos, on our podcasts, and on our Facebook page.
And our TikTok. Clark, by the way, in case any of this shows up on TikTok, Clark is still part of the show. She's out doing weeb shit this week.
Yeah.
She's actually out watching the Spy Family movie in theaters because it's a limited release. So she gets a pass for being gone this week.
Yeah, as far as excuses go, that's not bad.
We didn't kick her off the show. She still has permission to speak.
And she's not...
Although, at some point...
She's not just running from the wrestling, for the record.
Yeah.
At some point, people need to start doing some TikTok dances. I don't do that because I edit, so that's everybody but me.
That sounds like a Ryan problem.
Oh, come on. I'm supposed to be in charge
of
not like creative, right? That's not my job.
Yeah. Dancing's pretty creative.
Yeah.
But with that, we're going to bring this episode to a close. Join us next week. We're going to be talking about when Nerdverse meets pro wrestling in specific instances. For those of you that want to do a little pre-show watching, definitely check out groups like The New Day, DIY, which is Tommaso Ciampa and Johnny Gargano, old Johnny Wrestling, Will Ospreay, If you're a huge fan of Final Fantasy, because I'm currently playing through the Final Fantasy games again, definitely check out Kenny Omega. His finishing maneuver directly inspired by Final Fantasy VII, and if you can guess what it is, we'll see if we can get you like a little prize or something, maybe a Crossing the Nerdverse sticker or something cool like that, if you can tell me why his one winged angel is directly linked to Final Fantasy. So with that, we're going to bring it to a close, and we will catch you next time.
See you guys.